I want to bring in Andrew Weissmann, former FBI general counsel, former senior member of the Mueller probe, and an MSNBC legal analyst. Also with me, former Ohio Republican Governor John Kasich, who is an MSNBC political analyst, and NBC's Juan Hilliard with me here on set. Andrew, do you think Smith's argument is convincing enough to keep the charges against Trump intact?
What's remarkable here is that even with the Supreme Court ruling that knocked out all evidence that was plainly official conduct where it couldn't be rebutted to show that it was being taken on behalf of a candidate, there still is just unbelievably strong evidence. My takeaway from this brief is that obviously if Donald Trump is not elected president, and so he, because obviously if he wins the election, he will just have his Department of Justice dismiss this case. But if he is not elected, this case is going to go forward. The level and quantity of proof from all sorts of sources, mostly from within his own campaign and his own lawyers, up to and including his own vice presidential candidate, is replete. So there's very, very strong evidence that's recounted in this compendium that was put forth by Jack Smith.
So let me get a little more specific, if I can, Andrew. The filing has details about what Trump himself supposedly said. For example, he told family members, quote, "It doesn't matter if you won or lost the election. You still have to fight like hell." What's the value of including statements like that?
So what is different in this brief that we didn't have as much in the January 6th committee hearings is direct statements, direct evidence with people who were speaking to the president and also heard what the president had to say. So you have direct admissions. And there's sort of two pieces to that. One, it's plain that he is speaking as a candidate. And frankly, for all of the viewers out there, of course he is. He was interested in being reelected. That was his primary motivation, and that was the reason he did a whole slew of things. One really interesting, lovely vignette as to that is in a really important meeting with Rudy Giuliani, who was acting as his private counsel. Donald Trump kicked his White House counsel, his official counsel for the White House, out of the meeting. So if there's anything that indicates that this is a private discussion, not an official discussion, that's just a wonderful vignette that Jack Smith latches onto. So here you have both really strong evidence that the president was acting as a candidate to try and to win the election in spite of the fact that the votes were against him. That's the criminal conspiracy. And you have really strong evidence, if and when this goes to trial, of his mens rea, that is his mental state, that he was aware in the clip that you just noted that he didn't care whether he won or lost. He was going to say that there was fraud. It didn't matter what the facts were. And that is the Donald Trump that we all know very well. Facts do not matter in sort of Earth 2.
So, Governor, a couple of other examples. The filing describes Trump being told on January 6th that Mike Pence had to be evacuated, and Trump's response was, "So what?" Pence himself told Trump at least 5 times there's no evidence of voter fraud. I mean, the details are new, but this is, frankly, the Donald Trump most Americans already know. So politically speaking, and I'm really interested in those middle-of-the-road voters who may still go either way, does this move the needle?
Perhaps a little bit, Chris, but look, people are dug in, and there are going to be Republicans that are going to say, hey, this was an October surprise that dropped on him in order to change this election, and it could fire up some of the Trump base. And then on the other side, the Democrats are going to be saying, well, you see, we told you so. Where does it come out? It may come out, marginally against Trump, but I'm not sure. But when we talk about October surprises, Chris, there's a couple things going on right now that could be labeled as an October surprise. And one of them is the strike that's going on, the port strike. And you could begin to see prices dramatically ramp up. I heard this morning that there are people now that are going to these stores, these big box stores with pallets, trying to take all their stuff out of there because they're afraid there'll be shortages. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen exactly to prices, but they're not going to go down. They're going to go up. Is that an October surprise? How about what's happening in the Middle East? I mean, there's so much that's changing over there, and not just the invasion of Lebanon, but Gaza, the West Bank, what's going to happen vis-a-vis Iran. I mean, there is another thing that could come as an October surprise. And then thirdly, how about the storm? What's happening in North Carolina? Are people getting the help that they need? What's going to happen with insurance prices? So there are many things in this crazy election year floating around that could be an October surprise, and this is just one of them. What's going to have the biggest impact? Hold on, we're going to have to see.
Yeah, buckle up. So, Vaughn, he's right. I mean, we were talking about this triple threat. Now you have this added in. What's the former president saying about this?
His social media account would tell you that it's at the forefront of his mind. For Donald Trump, this is an issue that has continued to follow him for the last 3.5 years. But let's be very clear here. Donald Trump continues to claim that he won the 2020 election. As late as 2022, he was still calling for a redo of the 2020 election. Just take a listen to him last night in response to this redacted brief being released.
This was a weaponization of government, and that's why it was released 30 days before the election. And it's nothing new in there, by the way, nothing new. They rigged the election. I didn't rig the election. They rigged the election.
To be clear, the D.C. federal judge, Judge Chutkan, is the one who decided to release this 100%. Redacted filing. His attorneys, as the judicial system will play out, have the opportunity to file their own response over the next 2 weeks. They've requested 5 weeks to do that, to the Jack Smith immunity briefing that it was just filed and released publicly yesterday. So they will have the opportunity to do that. But for the American public, this is going to come down to Election Day. And whether this case will ever see the light of day, even if Judge Chutkan rules that some of the conversations that he had with Vice President Pence are immune, and even if some of these specific charges were to be tossed, this for the American public is going to be a decision on November 5th of whether this federal election interference case will go forward come 2025, 2026. Because as you heard, Donald Trump is making the very case that the fact that this case is proceeding in real time amounts to election interference in its own self. Of course, the charges against him are for federal election interference.
Andrew, what do you think the chances are that Trump's team gets this extension?
I think probably pretty good. This is a very lengthy brief, and I think that Judge Chutkan, remember, she comes from a defense background as a federal defender, and she has been very fair. And before she makes any ruling, she hears from both sides. So I think that, maybe she won't give them all of that time, but I wouldn't be surprised if she does. She is not trying to get things done before the election. She has just got a mandate from the Supreme Court as to what she has to do. And she is sticking to that. But I wouldn't be surprised if they're given more time, just given the length of the submission. It's interesting because you would think Donald Trump, if he really thought that he had either factual evidence or legal arguments to be made, that he'd want to get that in before the election, just as a political matter, so that his version would get out. But he fought tooth and nail to not have the submission that was filed yesterday ever see the light of day. And I think now that we have seen it, we understand why. Final point on this, the evidence here is coming from his own people. It's really important to remember that to sort of lay this on Jack Smith is really not fair, because he is recounting what people said who were up to and including Donald Trump's own vice president. So the source of this information are Republican loyalists to Donald Trump, and that's where the information is coming from.
Yeah, speak to that part of it, Governor. I mean, again, I go back to his base is his base. Kamala Harris's supporters are Kamala Harris's supporters. We're looking at, depending who you talk to, anywhere from 2 to maybe 9% of the population that may still be willing to go one way or another. The fact that all of these examples come from people who were within his circle, all the way up to Vice President Mike Pence. Does it have an impact there?
Well, look, again, I think, as to these undecided people, they're going to look at this. But as I mentioned, these other issues, what the heck is happening with the strike? Do all of a sudden do they get impacted in the store when they go in to try to buy something and the prices have gone through the roof? Because I've told you earlier, I think people care most about the pocketbook and also about the economy. Here's the issue, I think. Here's the issue, Chris, I think makes sense. There is great intensity among the Trump supporters. However, the amount of Republicans that would stay away from supporting Trump is pretty significant. Maybe it's 15%. When it comes to Harris, people may not be as dedicated to her as she would like, but at the same time, Democrats are going to vote. So you're going to have more Democrats getting to the polls and supporting their nominee than Donald Trump is. And so that has an impact in and of itself before we even think about the people who are undecided. Put it all together, flip a coin, but, the momentum is with Harris. But it's still early. It's early October. We got a whole month to go, Chris.